Welcome to, what day is it? Tuesday. I'm going to talk to you about Maven Central. But before I ask you, how many have heard of this name? Sonotype? Oh, look, lots of people. Normally I ask people who, if they've heard of this, don't get very many names. But you know about Maven Central, don't you? Yeah. So my name is Steve Poole. I'm the Director for Developer Relations at Sonotype. And Sonotype run Maven Central, which is a surprise for many people. And so I'm going to talk about what we do, what's happening, and why, in the end of the day, it has a big impact on you, because the world is changing, and as developers, your world is changing too. So let's look at this, right? Where does it start? Well, it starts with code, right? At some point, press the right button. At some point, we want code, and you Google for it. Whatever it is, there is a thing you want, whether you Google for it directly or whether you go, what do I need? What's out there that can solve this problem or give me this capability? You go somewhere and you search for it. And whatever you're trying to do, you're ending up looking for coordinates. Something like that, or maybe one of the others ways of using Java code. You're pulling down the dependency that goes into your supply chain. Now, supply chain is not a word two words that we use very often, but it's becoming more and more important to understand. Supply chains are the things that you're part of, both as from a company point of view, everybody's part of a supply chain, but as software, you have a supply chain, and it's the bit where you pull down dependencies, you create things, you publish things, whether it's publishing code for somebody else to use, maybe back on Maven Central, or maybe it's a service you offer or a product. Doesn't matter. You have a supply chain, stuff you pull in, right? And it comes down, if we're in the Java space, from Maven Central, right? We pull down enormous amounts of stuff. Your application, the code that you write, is based on the value that the open source community has added for you. Whether it's the operating system, whether it's frameworks, whether it's little bits of code, 90% of your application, you didn't write it, somebody else wrote it, and they shared it, and you used it. 90%. So that's a big number, right? Without it, we couldn't do what we're doing, right? You think about how you produce an application if you had to write everything down to the device drivers for the hardware. You know, it's impossible. So we're really lucky that we can get hold of all this stuff for free, right? And of course, in the Java space, it's all about Maven POMs and Maven Central, because that's where the code comes from, right? And if you've looked into it, this is where we go. You go to repo.maven.apache.org and you pull stuff down. It's always been there, okay? It's always been there. You've relied on it all the time. So I want to do a few things. I want to explain to you what Maven Central actually is. I want to talk about why it's evolving. And I have some homework for you. And these things are going to be mixed a little bit. And then if we have time, we'll have Q&A. Okay, sound good? Yeah, right. So, Maven Central. It's been around forever. Well, it was created by these two gentlemen, Brian Fox and Jason Van Zyl. Maven Central was a consequence of creating Maven. These are the authors, primary authors of Maven, the tool, because they were and still are very keen on developer productivity. And Maven has lots of features which you may or may not use, because primarily you now use it as a build tool to download dependencies. And it was recognized from day one that having a tool that lets you manage your dependencies requires you to have a place where dependencies are stored, right? So that's what they did. So 2003, this is all part of the Apache space, just funded by public donations, running on a machine under Brian's desk, as it was, right? So it's small. 2005, it got a bit separated because they needed to be a bit more resilient. Still money coming in from from donations to run Maven Central. That was the beginning. And if you fast forward to now, we run it, we pay for it, right? We don't need public subscriptions. We do this. Sonotype runs Maven Central for the ecosystem for free. So you're going to say, why? What's in it for us? Why are we doing this? Because we've been doing this since the beginning. Brian Fox was one of the starters of Sonotype, the company, and he was and is and always will be focused on open source. So the reason that we provide Maven Central for free is because it was getting expensive. And that may sound weird, but it was getting expensive that asking the public donations was like, this isn't going to work, right? And the reason that the flip tape took place was, well, it grew up. It went from being something under somebody's desk to a couple of machines to a massive service, right? So look, here's some numbers. So last year, almost 500 billion downloads from Maven Central. That's a large number in anybody's vocabulary. There's 8.8 million components up there, 79,000 namespaces, 27 terabytes of space being taken up. That's large. And you imagine what it takes to provide that 24/7, full availability. It's expensive. So it became necessary to flip the model. Right? And Sonotype, because of Brian and others, are going, we're just going to do it. So Sonotype runs this for the community. We get some value, but the biggest value is because that's what we do. It's always been our contribution to the open source community and to the Java ecosystem. Now, the system itself isn't too complicated. There's sort of three things that happen. You can be a publisher, so you're one of the minority of people in the Java space that creates code to share. So there's publisher. And basically, if you know Sonotype, we have this thing called Nexus, which is the repository system. So we use that. There's some Jenkins things at the back. So stuff comes in, packaging, processing, scanning, which I'll talk about in a minute. Goes in basically a big bucket. And then if you want to pull stuff out, you go down the middle line. So high-speed access to a bucket of stuff for you to pull down. And then there's search, because obviously you need to find things. So not particularly complicated, but still big enough and so necessary that we have to run it as a 24/7 service, okay? So I want you to understand, so we do get value, right? Maven Sonotype does get value because we get to see patterns, we get to see access patterns, we get to see data. And that's valuable. And we're using that data to come back to provide you some more stuff, which I'll talk about later, right? But the thing is, we're doing this because Sonotype believes this is the right thing to do. So we're never going to commercialize it, right? We've been running it since 2003. And to be honest, you probably didn't know that. And the only reason we're talking about it, the only reason we're here talking about this is because what else is going on, you need to become aware, not just of what we're doing from a Maven Central point of view, but generally the changes that are happening that you as a Java developer need to be aware of. Okay. So, there's one other thing that costs, apart from running the service, and that's keeping your application safe. Because you don't want any old stuff put up on the repo, do you? You want to have some sense that what's up there is safe, don't you? Or do you just download stuff regardless? Well, actually, a lot of you do download stuff regardless. However, we do have protections that you may or may not be aware of, okay? So if you're a Java developer and you want to publish on Maven Central, and you own a package, com.foo, whatever it is, that package is the same as a domain name, foo.com. And that's been in Java since the beginning. And so we make use of the fact that that is there to say you cannot publish to Maven Central unless you can prove you own the domain. And so there's some rules about what you have to do to be able to put domain records in to prove you own it. But once you've got that, then you can publish to Maven Central. Now, amazingly, a lot of the other repos systems in IT, Python and Node and stuff like that, don't have this protection. And that causes us a big challenge, because anybody can publish anything. They don't have to prove they own it. And you can publish com.foo or the equivalent, and I can publish com.foo. You could do com.foo version 1, I could do com.foo version 2. And as a consumer, you have no idea who put the thing up. At least with Maven Central, you are protected from that sort of namespace confusion, which is so bad in other ecosystems. That's the first one. That's easy because we have namespace protection, namespace ownership in Java, right? So that keeps all the horrible things that are targeted at Python and things like that. One of the other things, so Sonotype is a supply chain security company. So we look at all these different repos, and we're always looking for bad stuff, and we're always trying to take it down. In the Python space, we take down tens of thousands. Takedown means we make a report to Python pipeline, and we go, we found some malware in your repo, take it down. And they comply. And we do tens of thousands of that a year, because there are tens of thousands of malware bots trying to put bad stuff in, because it's easy. They don't do that on Maven Central because it's hard. You have to own a domain, and that means money and stuff like that. Right? So we keep the bad bag going. Now, that's the easy bit. Everything else is hard. When somebody publishes something to Maven Central, we are trying to ensure that it's as safe as we can make it, right? So what does that mean? We need to scan it, right? Look for bad code. Can we find malware, right? Can we detect it? Can we stop it being published? Blah, 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 right? And also try and make sure that you know what you're getting, because we don't want Maven Central to be a black box. We want to give you the data you need to make the right decisions. Right, so when code is uploaded to Maven Central, it goes through all the commercial scanning tools that we have, right? And the only thing that we're going to chuck away is if we find active malware. So I'll just say that again. We scan everything. So we're looking for vulnerabilities in all the stuff, and we use, it's our tooling. If we find malware, which in the Java space is really, really tiny, we would prevent it being uploaded. If we find vulnerabilities, we will record them, but we will not throw them, we will not prevent it being published. It's not our job to police the content. It's your job to make sure that you choose the right stuff. So it's sort of our job to give you the best information we can. But we do not, and people say, why don't you like Log4j? Well, who heard of Log4j? Yes. Yes, yeah, it's like, don't talk about Log4j anymore. But when Log4j, Log4Shell came up, people were saying, why don't you prevent people downloading the bad versions? And the simple answer is, well, we shouldn't. Because there may be people who are using it in ways that are perfectly safe. Right? They may have worked around the problem. And for us to unilaterally decide to prevent something being downloaded, we may break somebody. Right? So we tend not to want to do that. What we tend to have is we want you to be making better decisions. So the scanning process is complicated. Because you think about where code is, right? So SCA, I think at the bottom, is called Software Composition Analysis. And that's sort of Russian doll thing. Look inside things. Look inside the zips, or it's got a jar. Look inside the jar. What can you find? Right? And depending on how good the tool is, will tell you how deep you can find. Right? So some tools will literally just say, "Oh, I've looked in the first level. I've looked at your code, and I've figured out you've got a bunch of jars. That's all I've got." Other tools will go much deeper. Because, and I'll come on to the sec, this isn't about just looking for things that developers have packaged. We're looking for all the bad stuff that people are trying to insert. So we're actively looking for malicious insertion of vulnerabilities, bad things, all the time. And as an aside, when you walk away from here and you start thinking software composition analysis, software supply chains, these are new terms. It's worth going a look and start reading about them because there's a bunch of stuff coming around this space. But the important bit is so the Sonotype stuff goes down like to method level and we have a bunch of researchers who spend all the time trying to do this. So we apply this to Maven Central. So you get the best of the scanning that we can put in there, right? And it's getting harder because of these bad guys, which I've just said. So we are trying really hard to give you the best protection we can, give you the best information. We're not going to take stuff down unless it's got active malware in, but we will give you as much as we can tell you about the stuff that you're going to download, right? And it's getting really hard to do because the number of attacks that are being made is just escalating. So this little innocuous thing on the side here, the graph, is these little numbers, trillions of dollars. Trillions of dollars. This is how much the bad guys think the estimates. So where are we at? 2023, 11 trillion. Well, it's somewhere between 8 and 11. So let me put that in context. What is 8 trillion? $8 trillion. What can you do with $8 trillion? You can buy 650 of the largest aircraft carriers in the world. 650. If cybercrime was a country, by GDP, it would be the third largest country in the world. And if this continues, by 2027, in fact, 2026, 2027, the amount of money that we lose, the bad guys make, will be more than the gross national product of the US. You can't, it's just stupid numbers, isn't it? But that's why things are so bad, and that's why everybody is trying hard to fix the problem, and we're trying to do our bit, right? And I'm going to ask you to do your bit too, right? Now, just finally to put this in context, because we're talking trillions of dollars, trillions and trillions of dollars. Cyber drug trade, illegal drug trade, heroin, cocaine, all that sort of stuff, on a yearly basis, that's worth about $450 billion. 450 billion, 23 trillion. Because even at 2027, that 450 billion value for the drug trade isn't going to grow very much. because it's physical. You can see them, you can manage them. But cybercrime is completely ethereal. It's untrackable, untraceable, unpreventable, unless we do something about it. So that's the numbers that are going. And that says on this side why we have seen over the last couple of years the attacks that we would characterize as being supply chain attacks have gone through the roof, right? And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, which is just a bigger talk itself. But I want you to understand that these bad guys are very serious, and they are after your supply chain, which is open source, the stuff you download. Oh, and if that wasn't bad enough, of course, AI is turning up. AI is being used to do all sorts of amazing stuff. Itself, another talk, right? So don't think this is unsophisticated people attacking. This is very sophisticated people trying to get into systems, take over GitHub accounts, convince your manager to go somewhere, convince you to do something that gets them in the door, gets malware installed in your company, gets to take over your GitHub repos, all sorts of things they're going to try and do. Right? It's really happening, and it's happening now. And as I said, it's all about open source. Because if 90% of your application is written by somebody else, that means that 90% of your application is shared with somebody else. And you think about what rules you use for selecting open source. Right? So, where do you get your open source Java components from? Maven Central. So that's why we are trying as much as we can to add in protection, okay? Because the world has changed, right? The attacks have changed, the motivations have changed, the money being spent on it has changed. The time we have to deal with problems has changed. You have no time anymore, right? And a particular focus is on open source projects, right? It is ridiculous. So, what are we doing about it? Well, how do we help you navigate this horrible maze, avoid the bad guys, and get the code that you need to do your job and create your application with the lowest risk? What can we do, right? Well, you know that navigating any of these mazes is really hard, right? So what happens up here when you do this? Well, you could argue that the way that you choose open source, right, is you go, well, I'll just rationally pick something. I will do some investigation, and I'll pick the best one, and I'll stay away from the worst one, right? I'm going to be rational about it. But as we know, making rational decisions is hard because we get prejudiced by all sorts of things. Social influences, what our mates think, our personal values, right? And so what we do, and this isn't just software, this is in all life, you build mental decision-making heuristics. You try and short-circuit the process. Right? And you think about this, any way you choose, whether you choose going to a restaurant, going on holiday, you have some mental decision-making heuristics. Decision process, popularity. I'll choose that because most other people choose it, right? Or compatibility, that works. That's got so many features. Reputation, it's from somebody I trust. Documentation, hey, it's got some, which is unfortunately funny but true, right? There are other ones in here, right? Oh, and the license one, okay? It's not GPL. Happy Bunny, that's an actual license. We build these decision-making heuristics, right? Oh, and the last one, of course, is security. We let somebody else choose for us. We make these decisions, we've built these heuristics that goes, that's what I'm going to apply. And the problem is this is broken down, right? The heuristics we've all used need to change. In 2006, it's way ago. I mean, this millennium, but 2006. In 2006, if a vulnerability was reported, turns up on one of these websites, you had 45 days to apply a patch. 45 days. Luxury, right? Because the 45 days is the time between it being published and an exploit existing. Somebody looking, some of the bad guys, looking at what's been published and creating some way of hacking you using that exploit. 45 days in 2006. By the time we got to 2016, add 10 years, well, we've knocked it down to 15 days. So the bad guys are smarter, quicker. 15 days? Log4j comes out, you go, oh, I've got 15 days to apply a patch. Wouldn't that have been nice? But that's not how it works. Because now we live in an exploit-first world. Now, when a vulnerability is published, if it's a serious vulnerability, you can expect absolutely that it has been known by the bad guys first, and they are already exploiting it. Just think that through. So when we talk about this thing called the zero-day window. So this is with this idea of when a vulnerability came out, there were these worst cases where there was already being exploited. 0 days. You know, that 45 days had gone down to 0. But that's not true anymore. Yeah, certainly there are vulnerabilities which might be in that case, but they're not particularly useful. We have direct evidence, multiple direct evidences of major vulnerabilities being suppressed. Not being reported, being suppressed and sold. Because, again, let's use Log4j as a great example. We're all scared of Log4j, the worst vulnerability ever. Imagine if that had never been published. Imagine the bad guys had got on it first and we never heard about it. Imagine the damage to your system caused by that being exploited by the bad guys and you not knowing that that was happening. So that means that those exploits are now worth mega amounts of money, millions of dollars. There is a whole industry of people out there trying to find or create these vulnerabilities, and then they're going to charge for them. So if you have no ethics and you're a great hacker, you can make millions of dollars, right? And so we now face this world of, if you thought this was bad, imagine that being possible every day, because that's what these bad guys are trying to do. So that's why you have got to change your heuristics, the way that you select software. Right. So that's the bad story, and it's really happening. I could give you all sorts of details, but I want you to understand what's going on here. The world that you started when you joined and you started to do development, and you went to Google and you found something and you went up to Maven Central and you pulled down some coordinates, you put it in and it works. Maybe you checked the license. Maybe your company went, go check the license. But mostly you took this code on the belief that it was safe and that you could trust the people creating it. And that world is rapidly evaporating. So let's talk about what you can do. Because I don't want to leave you thinking, oh, the world's falling. What are we going to do about it? there are stuff you can do, and it's all your homework. This is stuff that you need to take away and think about and take back to your peers and think about how you deal with these things. Right, so the first thing is managing vulnerabilities. So what does that say? Well, it turns out that pretty much every time you download a dependency that has a vulnerability in it, there is already a version of that software that doesn't have the vulnerability in it. But everybody still keeps downloading stuff that has vulnerabilities in because people don't pay attention. So it's completely avoidable. Again, we'll go back to Log4j as a really good example of the problem was published. There was a fix available immediately. A big chunk of the world over Christmas and holidays fixed it. How many people were involved in fixing a Log4Shell thing? Oh, a few of you, okay. Everybody else is going, no, I'm not thinking about that anymore, right? So, because we run Maven Central, we understand what downloads are being made. And to this day, and I can put up a nice graph, but today, 30% of the downloads of Log4j, 30%, are for vulnerable versions. So naively, 1/3 of you think you're safe from Log4j problems, but you're not, because you're still downloading an old version of Log4j. Right? And it hasn't changed. 2 years on, and that number, there was a big drop when the first versions came out, big drop down, and we have seen, for 2 years, it runs about 25–30%. So people are not making the right decisions and are not looking at their SCA tools to work out whether they really have a problem. Your reliance on SCA tools, which is a good thing to have, you need to start saying, are these tools any good? Are they finding the problems? So one of the things I will give you for homework is, go find out what analysis tools you've got, what are being used in your company, and go read about what they do, and maybe write a test. Go think about things. So for instance, let's go back, Log4j. Log4j, one of the classes in Log4j, this JNDI class, was ripped out of the package, and it ended up in other people's packages, and it was added there by the bad guys. Right? It was just ripped out and used because it was the class that was the problem. Can your SCA tools find that class in a different package? What about taking the method that was the bad method out of that class and sticking it in some other method in a different class? Can your SCA tools look at the bytecode patterns and tell you that's happening? Right? Now, whether or not they can or they can't, you need to go think about, put your bad hat on and go, how would I do it? And then think 10 times more deviously, because the bad guys are really good at thinking deviously. But do have a look at the SCA tools you use and go, are they giving me the stuff I need? Right? So, first things first is, you could make a better choice now by looking at Maven Central. So tucked in this corner are 2 links, and I'll talk about both of them. Maven Central has a companion system which is called OSS Index. And that contains all the data that we have about everything. It's not just a Java thing, right? So if you go to, you take that link, and you'll get to, which is not the greatest homepage, but all the data we have about all the vulnerabilities that we know. So that's the public ones that are in like public databases, and everything that our security researchers find go up in here. So all the data we have is available for you to go look at. And as you can see, it's not just Java. Pick your favorite ecosystem and have a wander. Right? But if you pick a Java one, and you can go wander around this, and there's a nice little API if you want to do it programmatically. We are going to tell you a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to tell you what vulnerabilities that package version has, right? We'll give you what the details are. We'll tell you what the scoring is, tell you as much as we can about it for you to make those decisions. And hidden away is this little version migration data. Well, if you click on that, and it's not there for every single package, you get fireworks. Because we're watching the downloads patterns, and because we're doing such deep analysis of the classes, one of the things that we're able to work out generally is whether there are breaking changes. So if there's an API change that would break you, we can spot that. And so by looking at those, by looking at patterns, so if somebody in this room downloads something at this version and then 10 seconds later moves to the next version, the chances are that first version wasn't very good. And if we see a lot of people doing that, we can spot that it's not the best choice. So you can go to OSS Index and find, or you can see, so this is, every circle is from one version to another. What's the path, right? And the red ones are the ones that turned out not to be good, and then the blue ones turned out to be the ones that everybody else is doing, right? And as you can see, you end up with particular versions that people like, and then tucked in there, you can see that little bit of red. Because it turns out that's not an optimal condition. It may be because actually it's got a vulnerability in it, or it's a breaking change. But the information's there for you to have a look at. Okay? Now, the other link up there is an experimental tool, which is called Bomb Doctor. It's another part of Maven Central, the Maven Central suite here. It's quite hard to go and look at that migration chart. And if you've got loads of dependencies, it's like going to be, well, that's complicated. And actually, the chances are you don't even know what your dependencies look like, because you've got a POM with like 5, 10, 20 entries, but each of those entries pulls in other entries, doesn't it, from Maven Central? So one of the things that you need is a better way of understanding what you use. So if you go to Bomb Doctor, well, you can go for that link, or you can go direct to the service. We have a graphic visualizer for you, okay? And so I'm not demoing this stuff because it's experimental, right? It stands up most of the time. It's getting better. So you can get a picture. This is interactive. You can scale it and things like that, and you can see the dependencies and the dependencies, and it goes on to their dependencies and the whole set of dependencies that you have are visualizable. They're scored based on things which we'll talk about in a second, but they also include, has it got vulnerabilities in? Right? So you can go see which thing has got a problem for you and make some choices. And in fact, because we have some idea of the heuristics involved in moving to a different version and whether it's going to break you, we're experimenting with giving you even information about what's the best version to choose. So you can come to this tool and play around with it, say, what happens if I upgrade that or that, and get a sense about whether you've got a viable upgrade path that will work for you. And then you can take the data that it says and you can apply it to your POM. Hopefully, you're a lot better off. Now, there's one other thing tucked away in Maven Central that's not everywhere. It's beginning to show off. And that's this thing that we put in, which is called the safety score. We're trying to take all the data that we have, all the insight we've got based on the behavior of people downloading things, the analysis of the code, the vulnerabilities, and a whole bunch of ideas about other things, which I'm going to go through. And we're trying to distill that down to some scoring value. What we're trying to get to is to give you a better choice, not based on has it got a vulnerability or not, but a bunch of other indicators that tells you whether this is a safe project. Now, we're trying to do this. We're doing it in conjunction with Linux Foundation and CNCF and others. You're going to find, if you go Googling for this now, you'll find more and more tools appearing that talk about habits, the behavior of the open source project. Because if the bad guys are trying to compromise the open source projects, they're trying to compromise human beings. So how good is the human beings behind the code that you're using at being safe? Do they follow reasonable behavior? Do they have good habits? And we're trying to assess that to make that more available so that you can quantify your decisions. Because it's not only about, do I download this thing, has it got a vulnerability? What happens if the open source project that you download it isn't very good at security? What's the risk that tomorrow there will be one? So it isn't just about choosing now, it's also about choosing for the long term. Right? And we're trying to distill that, I say we, industry, into ways that will make use, that you can make use of. Right? So there we go. The way that you choose software, your heuristics needs to evolve, and you have to spend as much time thinking about the people who give you the code as to what it does. It's really important that you start to think protectively and reduce your trust barriers and think your trust levels and think about what's going on. There's a lot, right? There's lots of things to check. So unexpected release things. If they have a regular base of, if they release on a monthly basis, and then one day they do 5 in a row, that probably means that something was broken, or they got hacked, and somebody has put bad code in and is trying to get it into the system. Right? There's a whole bunch of rules that we could go through that says this is not going to be the best choice. And you can't do that on your own, because the only choice dependencies that you look at are the first level ones. You don't look at the dependencies of the dependencies of the dependencies, but we do. And we're trying to give you all that information. Right? There's all sorts of stuff which comes down to like build processes. Is it secure? Because if anybody can trigger a build process, and the bad guys like triggering build processes, they can add something at the end, add something into that zip file, do that through your build process, right? There's a whole bunch of these things being considered, right? And a whole bunch of studies. Though, interestingly, the one behavior that has been identified as making the most obvious indicator that these people take things seriously is whether they do code reviews. How many people here do code reviews as part of your development? Okay, well, about 50-50, okay. So the open source community, the people who do code reviews, their projects are generally much safer and produce less vulnerabilities than those that don't do code reviews. Right, so wrapping this up, there's a whole bunch of stuff, right? We do all sorts of analysis. So we have our rule, we have our views, there's what the Linux Foundation is doing, the CNCF, Open SSF, OWASP, there's a whole bunch of people doing this because at the end of the day, we're trying to help you do your job better and reduce the chores that you have in trying to update things all the time, right? And give you the data and the insight to choose more wisely so that you don't spend time on chores and you make sure that your company is as safe as you can be, right? So Maven Central, from a Java point of view, is going to be a great place for you to get the data you need to make those decisions. It's not the only place, but you can see we're trying to put it in the place where everybody comes to. I really encourage you to go have a look, come and play with Bomb Doctor, start to get your head in the game. Start thinking about why you chose stuff. Because there's going to come a point where you're going to say, we chose that feature for that dependency for that little feature, and we got all this with it. Do you want that? Bomb Doctor is a great way to see that. Choose some dependency that you're interested in. Go see what it depends on. Because it may be that there's so much dependencies that you don't really want. Right? There all becomes risk factors. And now you may say, maybe we'll write that code ourselves rather than use somebody else's because it's safer than the consequences. So there we go. Sonotype. We're not just the Maven Central stuff, people. We have a bunch of other stuff. Whether or not you use them is up to you. But I hope you get there's a lot more behind all this than just a repo. There's a lot more work coming. And hopefully you can benefit from all that activity. So there we go. Thank you. Do we have any questions? Thank you. No questions? Are you all shocked? Well, I'm disappointed. Come on. No? Okay, well, thank you very much.